Now that we have examined the classical period with Greece and Rome, I am going to shift us to an entirely different era. It's an era that is known as the Middle Ages, and a lot of historians actually title it the Dark Ages. And mainly the reason why is because a lot of very traumatic events occur in Europe during the Middle Ages. For example, the Black Death or the Plague, also the Crusades. How I want you to think of the Middle Ages is that this is a period where after Rome falls, you have a lot of areas that for the very first time are able to create independent nations. So it is a time of change, a time of upheaval, and there is actually a lot of potential here for nations like France and England to become very dominant. When you discuss the Middle Ages, the very first area I really like to address is the role of the Christian church. Now, when I reference the church during this period, I am talking about Catholicism. And the church became really the entire world of the Middle Ages. And when we talk about traumatic events, this is the place that was considered to be the haven. This is where people turned for inspiration to get them through these really tough times. To understand some of the basic ideas behind the way that the medieval church was ran, I like to start with the term aestheticism, which you see that the definition of aestheticism actually is hermit or exercise. So when you're curious about where the Catholic Church has these ideas about monks and nuns and taking vows that include particularly chastity and also poverty and humility, it actually begins with the Middle Ages. The founder of the aesthetic movement, or what will also be known as the monastic movement, is St. Anthony. To explain Anthony and his idea, I will tell you that he decided that living within a large city or around a large group of people was very tempting. When I say tempting, I mean that Anthony believed that when we are exposed to sin, it is hard to avoid committing sin. So his concept was that he believed that in order to be able to meditate and to find himself closer to God, he wanted to move out to the middle of nowhere. His idea was to move to the middle of a desert. It's not exactly the grand location I think a lot of us would pick, but he saw the desert as isolation. And this way he could separate himself from world temptation and he could focus on the things that he thought was necessary for him to be a pious individual. What happened is that a lot of people heard about this man who had moved to the middle of the desert, and there were people who actually followed him. Perhaps they were also seeking an escape from their own life. But what St. Anthony eventually concluded was that, one, living in the desert is not a lot of fun. It's very hot during the daytime, but then it gets very cold at night. The elements are very hard to adjust to. So he eventually evolved his theory where he decided that you could live in cities among people who are sinners, but that does not mean that you have to follow them, that you can still have an area that is very separate from the mainstream society and still do the things that he wanted to do, which is pray and sort of contemplate his soul and the position that he had with God. This is what leads us to the monastic movement, or what are called monasteries. Monasteries are structures that are very independent from the main community. Usually, monasteries are cut off by having very large walls that encase their buildings. But this is where monks and nuns actually were. And I will tell you the reality of the monastic movement is that a lot of the people who were there actually were not voluntarily there. You can think of the monastery as the middle age parents' reform school. There were a lot of young people whose parents placed them in monasteries because they were hoping that they would turn their life around. Maybe they were just simply a rebellious or a disobedient child, so they would place them in monasteries hoping that they would come out of them much more obedient, much more calm. So there are these sort of humorous stories about men and women who were thrown in monasteries and actually were trying to escape. And there's stories about them scaling the monastery walls, just begging to be let out, because the life of a monk or a nun at this time, it is very, very difficult to adjust to. But basically, when you built these monasteries in the Middle Ages, you had to have a very strict set of rules or laws that everybody knew what they were supposed to be doing. They had to know, okay, what can we do? What can we not do? So Saint Benedict gets a lot of the credit because he is the guy who actually sat down and he put together a book of rules on how monasteries should be ran, and it's called The Rules of Saint Benedict. Benedict is an interesting character because there are some really great stories about how many people in the monasteries really didn't care for him. And it was because his rules were very strict. They have a very strict schedule that I will show you in just a minute, where you can see what life really was like. But his idea was that you need to work at the monastery. It's not simply an easy life where you sit back and you get to just read the Bible and pray. These were hardworking communities. They grew their own food commonly, and so many people had to work. They did do a lot of charity work with the local community. That is very true. There's a great story about Benedict, though, that just to give you an idea of this, that there was a young man who was forced to actually hold a light over Benedict as he was eating his meal. And he had come from a family that had a lot of money. And so this young guy who's sitting here holding this lamp over this guy, he's basically asking himself, you know, why should I be doing this? Who is this guy to make me hold a lamp for him? Apparently, he was so unpopular that there were assassination attempts against Benedict. Strange stories about trying to poison his food and having a cup break that was poisoned, a bird swooping in and taking away his bread that was poisoned. So apparently, they were just, some people actively tried to get rid of him. Now, the schedule of a monk or a nun, if you think about what time you think they should get up and start their day, usually the common answer is probably around sunrise. It's actually a bit earlier than that. You see that you usually rise at around 2 to 3 in the morning. And I have laid out the schedule that you have. It is a very strict schedule where you always know what you are supposed to be doing. So you note that there are a lot of different daily prayers that are done. There is a time where you spend alone time where you contemplate your faith. And most importantly in this schedule is from 8:25 to 2:30, you go to work. That is where, if you were responsible somehow for agriculture, you would be out in the fields. You would be planting crops. You would be plowing the fields, harvesting crops. This is a very hard life. I think you understand why, if this is not chosen by you, that you would possibly want to run out screaming. Because by about 2:30, you eat your dinner. and you go ahead and do another series of prayer and contemplation, and then by about 6 it's lights out because you get up so early in the morning. You have to go to bed at a decent time. So again, this is a difficult life for those who did not voluntarily enter monasteries. I do want to mention very briefly a interesting aspect to faith in the Middle Ages. It's a group known as the Mystics, or it's called mysticism. This is a much more emotional side to religion. And the reason it's stated as being much more emotional is that the mystics believed that you did not need to speak to a priest in order to communicate with God, and that you did not necessarily have to sit in a church, that you could speak to God at any time that you wanted to. So the mystics really believed in a much more personal connection with their faith. It's much more internal than following a lot more of the ritualistic side of faith. And what's somewhat connected to this that's also very interesting is the emphasis that is placed on certain religious figures. For example, the Cult of the Virgin. This is when Mary gets a lot of significance in the Catholic faith. And one of the reasons why that's very simple is because if you can communicate with anyone, it doesn't matter who it is. Mary is the mother of Jesus, and their view was that why not go to the mother if you can't talk to the son? So Mary became very important. Also, the whole idea that Mary is a representative of an ideal mother, an ideal wife, that also was very appealing. The last thing I want to mention that's also very interesting is what is known as Bones of the Saints. This is a practice that much later on will be very heavily criticized, particularly by the reformer Martin Luther, who opposes a lot of the Catholic Church's practices. Basically, what Bones of the Saints is that there were members of the church who were selling holy relics to the everyday person. And a relic is usually an item that is special in some way or holy because it usually belongs to someone that is either a saint or a biblical figure. So, for example, they would claim that they had actual bones that belonged to saints, and they would sell them at a certain price, and it would bring you good luck. It would ward off evil, and it was a good business. They also would claim that they had hair from different people's head. They had thorns from the crown that Jesus wore at his crucifixion, hay from the manger where he was born. I think what you can get from this is that it's a big racket for a business because a lot of the bones they were selling were actual animal bones, not human bones. And a lot of the relics they claim they had were just imposters. It was hair, I guess, off the head of somebody from the church and on and on. So it really was taking advantage of just the everyday person. And that's why much later on, these types of practices get very heavily criticized, and there was some reform. I do want to shift a little bit from the church, and I want to talk about the only real significant ruler that I will mention during the Middle Ages. It is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is going to rule over an empire that is known as the Frankish Kingdom. And when you hear that word, the Franks, we are talking about modern day France and also part of Germany. His empire was known as the Holy Roman Empire. One of the reasons why is because Charlemagne was a Christian, and he was determined to be a defender of the faith. That's actually what the title Holy Roman Emperor actually means. It's bestowed on rulers by the Pope, who states that they are upstanding Christians and they are helping spread the faith in their territory. What I want you to note about Charlemagne is his many contributions for the time period. He is going to bring in a time in his area known as the Carolingian Renaissance. His family line is known as the Carolingians. That's where they get the name from. He came from a long line of kings. kings. And Charlemagne, as he is described in history, you can see his portrait here. He was described as a warrior. He was very athletic, very tall. He also was very brave in battle. He was a very good leader, and he also was described as being quite handsome. What is really significant about Charlemagne is not simply that he creates an empire that in some ways resembles Rome, but more importantly, this guy who did not know how to read and write as a child, did not know how to read and write as an adult. He actually began an education program where he encouraged all children to have access to education, not simply just boys, but also girls. Charlemagne's daughters and his granddaughters were literate. That is an astounding accomplishment for a period where very few people were literate. Very few people could read and write. When Charlemagne eventually dies, what's really sort of a shame is that his kingdom was left to his sons, and they really just destroyed it. They argued over the territory, and they were not good leaders like their father, and it led to the demise of this empire that he had worked so hard to create. I also want to mention a very important economic system which will dominate Europe literally from the Middle Ages all the way up until the French Revolution, which begins in 1789. It's just centuries of a system that is going to create a caste system. It is feudalism. The best comparison I can give you for a modern version of feudalism, in America, after the Civil War, there was a system known as sharecropping that a lot of poor people participated in. It's very similar to feudalism. Basically, what feudalism is that most of the land in France was gifted to the nobility by the king. So the king would give pieces of land to people who were his favorites, people with money, also knights. And a lot of them, rather than working their own land, they hired people to do that. That is what feudalism is. It's the concept that someone is hired to move onto the land. They work the land, yet they do not own it. So any monetary benefit that they're getting is very minor, and they're putting in all the work. There's not a lot of payout. The feudal system worked where literally if you decided to do this, most people did because they had nowhere to go. You took an oath to the person who owned the land. So you actually took an oath of loyalty. This person could actually not simply just hold you to your work. They could call you up and make you go, and you would have to be in their place for warfare. So for example, if a lord decided that a war broke out, he didn't want to serve, he could ask the person that was living on his land to go in his place. Happened frequently. And there was very little that you could do to avoid these types of askings by the Lord. So feudalism is a way to create a caste system. And like I said, it's a clear divide between people who are free landowning aristocrats and the majority of the population, which basically are farmers. They're very poor. And it stayed in place for centuries. Now, a lot of people, when they think of the Middle Ages, they do immediately go to the idea of knights and very fair ladies. The code of chivalry did really exist during the Middle Ages, and becoming a knight was considered one of the most prestigious occupations that you could possibly undertake. Being a knight was a way for you to move up in society. And in fact, when they began the knighthood, anyone could join. Didn't matter where you were born. What becomes really unfortunate is that as time goes on, the knighthood became a very elitist society, and they closed the door to anyone who did not have title and money. But basically, when you decided to be a knight, You began when you were about 8 years old, and you were sent to live with another lord who was responsible for your education. So eventually, you began working your way up from position to position. So if you've heard of titles like a page, it's associated with the training you get to become a knight. You start as a page when you're about 8 to 10, and you are given a good Christian education because the knighthood takes an oath that includes a lot of Christian values. When you're about 12, you move from a page to a squire. The squire takes care of the weapons. So this is where you learn a lot about weaponry. You actually help the Lord get dressed for battle. You clean and take care of his weapons. When you are 21, that is when you take your oath and become a full-fledged knight. This was taken very seriously. If you were found, for example, breaking your oath, behaving in a way that was considered unchristian, also a way that would be very ungentlemanly, they could have you removed from the knighthood, which would be a huge disgrace. Usually they would take your weapons and break them, and they would have a priest come in and declare you dead to honor. Basically means from that point on, you're done. Nobody would probably take you in. Your family would disown you because it would be humiliating to their name. When you talk about the knights, a lot of people also naturally go to one of the biggest wars that happens during this period, which is known as the Crusades. This is a Christian crusade. It is a holy crusade. The Pope is the person who actually called for warriors to rise up. The purpose of the Crusades was to travel to Jerusalem and to inhabit it for Christians, to take it away from the influence of Muslims that had lived there for quite a while. This is a very long campaign. I mean, look at the time period from 1096 to 1291. There are many separate campaigns. And what's really a shame about this is that there is no victory. By the end of the Crusades, most people had forgotten entirely why they were even fighting. It went from being supposedly a very religious purpose to where a lot of the behavior and the activities were as far away from faith as you could even imagine, or as far away from morals or ethics. And to give you a sort of an example of the rhetoric or the propaganda that was used to encourage people to go on the Crusades, this is actually from the speech that Pope Urban II gave when he called for the very first crusade to begin. So you see the quotation here. Describing the Persians, which he is referencing the Muslims, he calls them an accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, and says that they have invaded the lands of the Christians and depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. And then ask that if this is happening, you have to go and correct these wrongs. The reason I say it's propaganda is because it's exactly that. He creates a very clear enemy. He says that they're alienated from God. They're different from what they are, and they have to be eliminated. Some people went on the Crusades because they really bought into this, that this was their Christian duty, that this somehow was God's mission for them. There were other people, though, who were just seeking out an adventure. Some people wanted to go and get treasure and bring it back so that they would be rich. But the Crusades ends in a failure because Jerusalem is not liberated for everyone in Europe to go into it. One of the famous stories from the Crusades is the story of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar has shown up in modern culture, particularly film. For example, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom particularly references the Knights Templar. National Treasure mentions them. I believe Da Vinci Code as well includes them. The Knights Templar were recognized because of what they wore on the battlefield. They wore a red cross against a black and white backdrop. These were specially trained knights that were created by the church. The entire purpose originally was that they were supposed to protect the roadways so that when pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem, they would be safe. But what eventually happened is that they became very powerful and very rich. When people began traveling, they actually were using the Templar as a bank. They were depositing all their money and all their goods for safekeeping so that when they came back, they could collect them. The story about the knights is that eventually there were even kings that owed the Templar money, that were in debt to them. The church became very fearful of them. They thought they had become too powerful. So basically what happened is that they were accused of heresy. And many of them were actually captured and burned alive at the stake. The mystique behind the Templar is that it's believed that a portion of them, once they knew they were being attacked, they actually went into hiding. And the story that's connected to them is the story of the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is supposed to be the cup that Jesus uses at the Last Supper. The story is that the Templar might have found the Holy Grail, and when they went into hiding, they took it with them. So it's a very interesting story. It's built up in a lot of secret groups and just a lot of mystery. There's a lot of unknowns about them. We, of course, have to talk about the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. This is, without doubt, one of the most traumatic events that Europe experiences. When you look at just pure statistics, it's really astounding. To imagine that almost half of Europe's population died because of this illness. I mean, if you even try to apply that to the world population today, to think about living in a country and half the people just drop dead. I mean, it would be so traumatic to actually live through. And that's exactly what it was like for people. Basically, what we know about the plague today is that it likely came from an outside source. It was not originally in Europe. It probably came by way of a boat. And it is transferred from fleas that are found on rats. So basically, the idea is that when the ships dock, the rats get off board, and probably while people have been on board, fleas transfer to humans. And that's how people became infected. The fleas bite humans, and then you get the virus. It was a very painful experience if you were exposed to the plague. These images give you a little insight. Basically, what would happen to you is that your skin would break out, and something that is very similar to a boil. But really what it is your lymph nodes are becoming very swollen, and then they become abscessed. They turn purple, and usually they would start bleeding at some point. Most people did not survive beyond a few weeks of infection. Those who lasted about to the third week, their fatality rate was well above 90%. So you can imagine if you get this illness, you more than likely would not survive it. These images reveal a lot of the methods that people used to try to find a cure. They were praying for a miracle. So they would bring members of the church in to actually perform blessings and to pray for them. But bubonic plague, without a doubt, one of the most significant events that happens during this time. One of the consequences of the plague is that there were segments of the population that clearly needed some enemy or some cause that they could point their finger at. They did not understand what caused the plague, so they found other sources to actually say that this caused it. One of the most unfortunate parts of the plague is that there were segments of the population that actually blamed Jewish towns for spreading the plague. It sounds very bizarre. The only explanation I can really give you is that when the plague broke out, when you look at pure statistics, there were segments of the Jewish population that did not become sick. The simple explanation is probably due to hygiene law. They did not share the well water with other Europeans, and they generally were more clean than other Europeans. Europeans rarely bathed during this time. Just kind of a side note about their hygiene. It would have been amazing if anyone bathed more than once a year. I mean, that was about the norm. About once a year, you took a bath. So they believed that somehow because this segment of the population's not becoming sick. They must be responsible for it. And there was a lot of violence that broke out. There were entire towns of Jews that were rounded up and actually burned alive at the stake as heretics. Another side to it is that rather than blaming a group of people, there were people who just simply argued that this was God's punishment to mankind, that man had committed some sort of grievous sin, and this was what God was doing. He was purging the population. And this group of people that are known as the flagellants, what they're known for is that they believe in a form of self-punishment to sort of reprieve or do penance for their sin. So they literally would whip their own flesh. It became so serious, the church actually had to release a statement and tell people not to do this, that self-harm is dangerous, and that the church was not actually calling for it. The cathedral itself, we've already talked about the importance of it in city life, but I do want to show you briefly the beauty behind the cathedrals that were built in Europe. I do want you to know that most of the cathedrals were built not from money that the church just happened to have. It was money that was donated to them from congregations and also from the townspeople. People were told that tithing particularly was a requirement. It was not voluntarily done. And there were a lot of threats that did happen to sort of guilt people into giving their money. But the churches that we see today that still are in Europe, these lovely cathedrals, they were generally built on the backs of people who were very hardworking. This is one of the earliest type of medieval churches. For the time period, it looks like a pretty large structure, but they are going to eventually progress beyond this. What I want you to note about it is some of the interior structures to the cathedral. One of the problems with building a church that rises up high in the air is how you actually support its weight. And if you do not have some support system in place, basically what happens is the walls fall in. This actually happened during the Middle Ages. So on the inside of this, we see a few support systems that are actually in place. We have things like vestibules. We also have arches. And the point of it is that it takes the weight off of the walls and it spreads it throughout the cathedral, where it actually helps the walls hold up. What we see, which is really the better representative of medieval architecture, are the Gothic cathedrals. Gothic cathedrals began in France, and they are known for a lot of different little elements. One, we see gargoyles. If you have ever been curious about what gargoyles do and why they're put on cathedrals, they have a dual purpose. First, they are meant to ward off evil. They're guardians of the churches. And secondly, they are also water spouts. So when water falls on the building, they're meant to be kind of a protective system. The water falls into them and it spouts out of their mouth. How Gothic cathedrals alleviated weight was through a system called buttresses. You can actually see from this photograph the buttresses on the outside of the church. It's these parts that are flowing out from the walls. That's holding the weight. A lot of the buttresses are actually inside the church. The next part that I want to show you is how they added light into the cathedrals. They did it through stained glass. When we look at stained glass windows, I mean, they're just simply beautiful. The stained glass itself, this is a very intricate process. You literally have to break glass into tiny pieces and piece it together on a design. A lot of the faces are actually painted on, and usually the windows were paid for by very wealthy members of the congregation. So they would kind of get their name put somewhere in the church. What I want you to walk away with from the Middle Ages really is the idea that the church becomes so central to daily life. Also the fact that the Middle Ages was a very difficult time period to live in. One of the best quotes I've ever seen about this period states that life in the Middle Ages was poor, nasty, brutish, and very short. And that, generally speaking, is a great way to describe it. It's not a time period that if you could time travel, you would just pick the Middle Ages. I think most people would generally avoid this. The good thing is that once we get past the Middle Ages, we move to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is the period of rebirth. It's where we leave this behind, this time that is so traumatic, and we get to a period that is going to change the course for Europe's history.